On June 18, 1982, a postal worker crossing Blackfriars Bridge in London made a discovery that would expose one of the most sinister financial conspiracies in modern history. Hanging from the scaffolding beneath the bridge was the body of Roberto Calvi, his pockets stuffed with 5 kilograms of bricks and $14,000 in 3 different currencies. This wasn't just any banker. This was God's banker, the man who had laundered billions for the Vatican and the Sicilian Mafia. What nobody realized was that Calvi's death would unravel a web of corruption that reached from the highest levels of the Catholic Church to the most dangerous criminal organizations in Europe. For 20 years, this mild-mannered Italian banker had been the key player in a financial empire that moved money for everyone from mafia drug lords to Vatican cardinals, from CIA operatives to terrorist organizations. But Calvi knew too much. His death came just days after $1.4 billion vanished from his bank, Banco Ambrosiano, money that belonged to the Mafia, the Vatican, and a secret Masonic lodge called Propaganda Due. The authorities initially ruled it suicide, but forensic evidence would later prove what Calvi's family suspected all along. He had been murdered. This is the story of how one man became the most dangerous banker in the world, moving dirty money through a network of shell companies that spanned from Panama to the Bahamas. It's the story of how the Vatican Bank became a front for money laundering, how the Sicilian Mafia financed its heroin empire, and how a secret society tried to overthrow the Italian government. Most shocking of all, it's the story of how Roberto Calvi was silenced forever because he threatened to expose the truth about the most powerful criminal conspiracy in modern history, a conspiracy that reached all the way to the Vatican itself. The death of Roberto Calvi represents one of the most complex criminal conspiracies in modern history, involving 3 of the most powerful organizations in the world: the Roman Catholic Church, the Sicilian Mafia, and a secret Masonic lodge that operated as a shadow government. To understand why Calvi was murdered, we must first understand the extraordinary criminal empire he had built over 2 decades as chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, Italy's 2nd largest private bank. Roberto Calvi was born on April 13, 1920, in Milan, just as Europe was emerging from the devastation of World War I. His early life gave no indication of the dark path he would eventually follow. He joined Banco Ambrosiano in 1947 as a junior clerk and steadily rose through the ranks through a combination of intelligence, ambition, and an uncanny ability to cultivate relationships with powerful people. By 1975, Calvi had become chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, transforming what had been a conservative Catholic bank into the centerpiece of an international money laundering operation. His nickname, God's Banker, came from his close relationships with Vatican officials, particularly Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the American-born head of the Vatican Bank, known as the Institute for Religious Works. But Calvi's most dangerous association was with Michele Sindona, a Sicilian financier known as the Shark, who served as the primary banker for both the Vatican and the Sicilian Mafia. Sindona taught Calvi the techniques for moving money through offshore shell companies, methods that would allow both legitimate and illegitimate funds to flow through a network of banks spanning 3 continents. The third pillar of Calvi's criminal empire was his membership in Propaganda Due, or P2, a secret Masonic lodge led by Licio Gelli. P2 wasn't just any secret society. It was an organization dedicated to overthrowing Italy's democratic government and establishing a fascist state. The lodge's membership included some of the most powerful people in Italy: politicians, judges, military officers, intelligence officials, and businessmen. They called themselves Frati Neri, Black Friars, a detail that would prove significant when Calvi's body was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge. Through P2, Calvi gained access to a network of corrupt officials who facilitated his money laundering operations. Through his Vatican connections, he gained respectability and protection from church authorities. Through his mafia ties, he gained access to massive amounts of illegal cash that needed to be cleaned and moved around the world. The scope of Calvi's operations was staggering. By 1982, Banco Ambrosiano controlled a network of subsidiary banks and shell companies that spanned from Luxembourg to Nicaragua, from the Bahamas to Peru. Money flowed through these entities to finance everything from mafia heroin trafficking to CIA covert operations in Central America. The Vatican used Calvi's network to move money to support anti-communist movements in Eastern Europe, while the Mafia used the same channels to launder the proceeds of their drug empire. For years, this system worked perfectly. The Italian banking authorities, many of whom were P2 members, turned a blind eye to Calvi's activities. The Vatican provided moral cover and financial backing. The Mafia provided a steady stream of dirty money that generated enormous profits for all involved. But by 1981, the system was beginning to unravel. Italian investigators, led by magistrates who were not members of P2, began examining Banco Ambrosiano's books and discovered evidence of massive illegal currency transfers. The Bank of Italy found that hundreds of millions of dollars had been moved out of the country in violation of Italian law. Meanwhile, investigative journalists were exposing P2's existence and its plans to overthrow the Italian government. When police raided Licio Gelli's villa in 1981, they discovered documents outlining a fascist coup and membership lists that included nearly 1,000 of Italy's most powerful citizens. The scandal brought down the Italian government and left P2 members scrambling to cover their tracks. As pressure mounted, Calvi's partners began to turn against him. The Vatican demanded repayment of loans that had been disguised as investments. The Mafia grew suspicious that Calvi had stolen their money. P2 members worried that Calvi might reveal their secrets to save himself. In May 1982, Calvi was convicted of currency violations and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Though he was released pending appeal, he knew that his empire was collapsing. More dangerous still, he knew that his former partners were beginning to see him as a liability who knew too much about their criminal activities. On June 5, 1982, Calvi wrote a desperate letter to Pope John Paul II, warning that the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano would cause a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions for the Catholic Church. It was his last attempt to secure protection from the Vatican, but the Pope never responded. 5 days later, Calvi fled Italy using a false passport under the name Roberto Calvini. He made his way to London, where he believed he could negotiate with his creditors and possibly save his empire. But his enemies had already decided that Roberto Calvi was too dangerous to remain alive. On the night of June 17, 1982, Calvi left his hiding place in Chelsea and walked to Blackfriars Bridge. What happened next remains officially unsolved, but investigators believe he was met by assassins who strangled him and then staged his death to look like suicide. The bricks in his pockets were meant to weigh down his body, while the location, Blackfriars Bridge, was chosen as a message to other P2 members about the consequences of betrayal. When Calvi's body was discovered the next morning, it marked the end of one of the most corrupt financial empires in history. But it also marked the beginning of a cover-up that would last for decades, as the Vatican, the Mafia, and surviving P2 members worked to bury the truth about Roberto Calvi and the criminal conspiracy he had helped create. Roberto Calvi's transformation from humble bank clerk to international money laundering began in post-war Milan, a city rebuilding itself from the ashes of fascism and foreign occupation. When he joined Banco Ambrosiano in 1947, at age 27, Italy was struggling to establish democratic institutions, while American intelligence agencies worked to prevent communist parties from gaining power through legitimate elections. Banco Ambrosiano was founded in 1896 and named after Saint Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan. It had been established as a Catholic bank to serve the financial needs of the church and devout Catholics who wanted their money handled according to Catholic social teaching. By the time Calvi arrived, it had grown into a significant regional bank, but it remained conservative in its outlook and closely tied to the Catholic Church hierarchy. Calvi's early years at the bank were unremarkable. He worked as a clerk in the foreign exchange department, processing routine transactions and learning the mechanics of international banking. His colleagues remembered him as quiet, methodical, and extraordinarily ambitious. He had a gift for mathematics and an intuitive understanding of how money moved through the international financial system. What distinguished Calvi from his peers was his ability to cultivate relationships with powerful people. He understood that success in Italian business required more than technical competence. It demanded the ability to navigate the complex web of personal relationships, family connections, and informal alliances that determined how business was conducted. His first important mentor was Carlo Alessandro Canesi, a senior figure at Banco Ambrosiano, who would later become president of the bank. Canesi recognized Calvi's potential and began grooming him for greater responsibilities. Under Canesi's guidance, Calvi learned not just banking, but the art of discretion that was essential for handling the financial affairs of wealthy clients who valued privacy above all else. During the 1950s, Italy experienced rapid economic growth as the country rebuilt from wartime devastation. American Marshall Plan aid flowed into the country, while Italian businesses began expanding into international markets. For banks like Ambrosiano, this created new opportunities to serve clients who needed to move money across borders for legitimate business purposes. But it also created opportunities for less legitimate activities. The chaos of post-war reconstruction had created ideal conditions for smuggling operations, tax evasion, and currency manipulation. Italian entrepreneurs discovered that they could dramatically increase their profits by avoiding taxes and currency controls, but doing so required sophisticated financial techniques that most local bankers didn't understand. This was where Calvi found his niche. His work in the foreign exchange department had taught him how currencies were traded and how exchange rates could be manipulated to maximize profits. He learned how correspondent banking relationships worked and how money could be moved through multiple jurisdictions to obscure its origins. Most importantly, he learned that the key to successful financial manipulation was maintaining relationships with bankers in other countries who would ask no questions about the source of funds. In 1952, Calvi married Clara Canesi, the daughter of his mentor. The marriage was both a love match and a strategic alliance that secured Calvi's position within the bank's inner circle. Clara's family connections provided him with access to Milan's Catholic elite, while her father's influence ensured his continued promotion within Banco Ambrosiano. By the late 1950s, Calvi had been promoted to assistant manager of the bank's international department. This position gave him responsibility for managing Banco Ambrosiano's relationships with foreign banks and overseeing complex international transactions. It also brought him to the attention of Michel Sindona, the Sicilian financier who would become his most important and most dangerous mentor. Sindona first encountered Calvi in 1959 when he was seeking financing for his expanding business empire. At that time, Sindona appeared to be a legitimate businessman who had built a successful career as a tax lawyer before moving into banking and finance. What Calvi didn't initially realize was that Sindona's clients included some of the most powerful mafia families in Sicily, and that his banks were being used to launder the proceeds of heroin trafficking. The relationship between Sindona and Calvi began innocently enough. Sindona needed access to northern Italian banks to finance his acquisitions of companies throughout Italy. Calvi arranged the necessary credit facilities and managed the complex financial transactions required for Sindona's deals. In return, Sindona taught Calvi advanced techniques for moving money through offshore jurisdictions and avoiding regulatory scrutiny. Sindona's methods were revolutionary for their time. He had pioneered the use of back-to-back financing, where loans in one currency were secured by deposits in another currency held in a different jurisdiction. This technique allowed money to be moved internationally, while creating a paper trail that was almost impossible for authorities to follow. More importantly, it allowed clients to avoid taxes and currency controls while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. Under Sindona's tutelage, Calvi learned how to establish shell companies in jurisdictions like Panama, Luxembourg, and Liechtenstein. These companies existed only on paper, but could be used to facilitate complex financial transactions that would have been impossible under Italian banking regulations. Money could be moved from Italy to a shell company in Panama, then transferred to a bank in Switzerland, then invested in securities traded in London, all while the original source of the funds remained completely obscured. By the early 1960s, Calvi had become Banco Ambrosiano's expert on international finance. His reputation for discretion and technical expertise attracted wealthy clients who needed to move money across borders without attracting government attention. Some of these clients were legitimate businessmen seeking to avoid Italy's complex and punitive tax laws. Others were less legitimate, including mafia associates who needed to invest the proceeds of their criminal activities in apparently legal businesses. Calvi's growing expertise in offshore finance also attracted attention from an unexpected source: the Vatican. The Catholic Church had extensive financial holdings throughout the world, but managing these investments required sophisticated techniques for moving money across international borders. Church officials were particularly interested in avoiding the socialist governments that were coming to power in various European countries, and they needed banking partners who could help them protect their assets. In 1963, Calvi was introduced to Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, a tall, imposing American who had been assigned to manage the Vatican's financial affairs. Marcinkus had no formal banking experience, but he had impressed Pope Paul VI with his organizational abilities and his understanding of American business practices. The Vatican needed someone who could help them modernize their financial operations and protect their wealth from political threats. By the mid-1960s, Calvi had established himself as an indispensable figure at Banco Ambrosiano. His expertise in international finance, combined with his relationships with Sindona and the Vatican, made him uniquely valuable to the bank's growing roster of wealthy clients. But these same relationships were also drawing him deeper into a world of corruption and criminality that would eventually destroy him. The foundation for Calvi's eventual downfall was being laid during these early years, though neither he nor his colleagues fully understood the implications at the time. His willingness to ask no questions about the source of his clients' money, combined with his growing expertise in offshore financial manipulation, was creating the infrastructure for what would become one of the largest money laundering operations in history. Michel Sindona's rise to become the shark of international finance paralleled Italy's post-war transformation from agricultural backwater to industrial powerhouse, but his success was built on foundations far darker than legitimate business acumen. Born into poverty in the Sicilian town of Patti in 1920, Sindona possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand complex financial transactions and an equally remarkable talent for cultivating relationships with dangerous people. Sindona's early education by Jesuit priests instilled in him both a sophisticated understanding of institutional power and a flexible approach to moral questions that would serve him well in his later criminal career. After graduating with a law degree from the University of Messina in 1942, he initially worked as a tax lawyer, helping wealthy Sicilians minimize their obligations to the Italian state through creative interpretation of complex regulations. But Sindona's real education came from his involvement in the black market operations that flourished in Sicily during and after World War II. When Allied forces landed in Sicily in 1943, they relied heavily on local mafia families to help organize food distribution and maintain order. This collaboration gave mafia leaders unprecedented opportunities to expand their operations, while providing young entrepreneurs like Sindona with access to American markets and sophisticated smuggling networks. By 1946, Sindona had established himself as one of Sicily's most successful black market operators, moving everything from food and medical supplies to currency and gold through networks that spanned the Mediterranean. His ability to navigate the complex relationships between Allied occupation forces, Italian authorities, and mafia families made him extraordinarily valuable to all parties involved. More importantly, these operations taught Sindona that the key to successful criminal enterprise was maintaining legitimate business fronts, while cultivating relationships with corrupt officials who could provide protection from law enforcement. He learned that banks were particularly useful for these purposes because they offered both respectability and sophisticated mechanisms for moving money without attracting attention. In 1957, Sindona moved his base of operations from Sicily to Milan, where Italy's post-war economic boom was creating unprecedented opportunities for financial manipulation. Milan was emerging as the country's financial capital, home to major banks and corporations that needed sophisticated financial services to support their international expansion. Sindona established himself as a tax consultant for major Italian corporations, using his expertise to help them avoid taxes and currency controls through offshore structures. His clients included some of Italy's largest companies, but they also included less legitimate businesses that needed to move money generated through illegal activities. It was during this period that Sindona first encountered Roberto Calvi at Banco Ambrosiano. The two men formed an immediate partnership based on their complementary skills. Sindona understood the global networks needed for large-scale financial operations, while Calvi possessed the technical banking expertise to implement complex transactions within the regulatory framework. Their first major collaboration involved establishing a network of offshore banks that could facilitate international transactions for Italian businesses. Sindona arranged the initial financing through his connections with American banks, while Calvi handled the regulatory approvals and operational details. The success of these ventures established both men as leading figures in international finance, while providing them with the infrastructure needed for much larger operations. But Sindona's most important contribution to their partnership was his introduction of mafia money into their banking operations. Through his family connections in Sicily, Sindona had maintained relationships with major mafia families who were seeking to invest the enormous profits generated by their heroin trafficking operations in legitimate businesses. The Sicilian Mafia's entry into heroin trafficking had begun in the late 1950s when American mafia families recruited their Sicilian cousins to serve as suppliers for the expanding American drug market. Sicilian chemists used their expertise in citrus processing to refine heroin from Turkish morphine base, while Sicilian smuggling networks moved the finished product to American markets. By the early 1960s, this trade was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in profits that needed to be laundered through legitimate financial institutions. Traditional mafia money laundering methods were inadequate for handling such massive sums, while the international nature of the trade required sophisticated financial techniques that only experts like Sindona could provide. Sindona's solution was to use the banking network he was building with Calvi to move mafia money through offshore jurisdictions where it could be invested in legitimate businesses or simply hidden from law enforcement authorities. The process was complex but effective. Heroin profits generated in New York would be deposited in Sindona's American banks, then transferred to shell companies in Panama or Luxembourg, then invested in Italian businesses through Banco Ambrosiano. This arrangement provided benefits to all parties involved. The mafia gained access to sophisticated money laundering services that allowed them to enjoy their profits without fear of confiscation. Sindona and Calvi earned substantial fees for their services while gaining access to enormous amounts of capital that they could use for their own investments. The banks involved earned profits from the various transactions while maintaining plausible deniability about the source of the funds. But Sindona's most audacious move was his cultivation of relationships within the Vatican hierarchy. Through his friendship with Giovanni Battista Montini, who would later become Pope Paul VI, Sindona gained access to the highest levels of the Catholic Church's financial operations. He convinced church officials that he could help them modernize their investment strategies and protect their wealth from communist threats. In 1969, Pope Paul VI placed a substantial portion of the Vatican's investment portfolio under Sindona's control, a decision that would ultimately cost the Church over $240 million. Sindona used Vatican money to finance his expanding banking empire while providing church officials with returns that seemed too good to be true, because they were. Sindona's Vatican connections provided him with more than just money. The Church's moral authority and diplomatic immunity offered protection from investigation, while its global network of institutions provided cover for complex financial transactions. Most importantly, Sindona's role as a Vatican financial advisor gave him access to Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the American-born head of the Vatican Bank, who would become a key partner in future operations. The relationship between Sindona, Calvi, and Marcinkus formed the foundation for what would become the most sophisticated money laundering operation in history. Sindona provided the international networks and mafia connections. Calvi contributed the banking expertise and regulatory knowledge, while Marcinkus offered Vatican protection and respectability. By the early 1970s, their operations had expanded to include banks in multiple countries, shell companies in dozens of offshore jurisdictions, and clients ranging from multinational corporations to terrorist organizations. Money flowed through their network to finance everything from legitimate business expansions to CIA covert operations in Latin America. But Sindona's empire was built on foundations that were inherently unstable. His banks were over-leveraged, his investments were increasingly speculative, and his relationships with dangerous criminals created constant threats to his personal safety. More dangerously, his high-profile lifestyle and political connections were attracting attention from investigators who were beginning to understand the true nature of his operations. In 1974, Sindona's empire began to collapse when the Franklin National Bank, his primary American operation, was declared insolvent due to foreign exchange losses and fraudulent loans. The bank's failure cost depositors over $2 billion and prompted investigations that revealed Sindona's connections to organized crime and his manipulation of Vatican finances. Faced with criminal charges in both the United States and Italy, Sindona attempted to engineer his own fake kidnapping in 1979 to avoid prosecution. When this scheme failed, he ordered the murder of Giorgio Ambrosiano, the court-appointed liquidator who was investigating his banks and threatening to expose his criminal connections. Ambrosiano's murder marked the beginning of the end for Sindona's empire. American and Italian authorities finally understood that they were dealing not with a legitimate banker who had made mistakes, but with a sophisticated criminal who had used the banking system to facilitate some of the largest financial frauds in history. Sindona was eventually convicted of fraud and murder and sentenced to life in prison. In 1986, while serving his sentence in an Italian prison, he was found dead in his cell after drinking coffee laced with cyanide. Whether he committed suicide or was murdered by his former associates remains unknown. But his death marked the end of an era in international finance. For Roberto Calvi, Sindona's downfall represented both an opportunity and a threat. The collapse of Sindona's empire removed a dangerous competitor while providing Calvi with access to many of Sindona's former clients. But it also demonstrated the risks inherent in the business they were conducting and the ultimate fate that awaited those who knew too much about the criminal operations they served. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus arrived at the Vatican in 1971 with no formal banking experience, but with something far more valuable: the complete trust of Pope Paul VI and an American businessman's understanding of how to manage large-scale financial operations. His appointment as head of the Institute for Religious Works, the Vatican Bank, would transform both the Catholic Church's financial position and the global money laundering landscape. Born in 1922 to Lithuanian immigrant parents in Cicero, Illinois, Marcinkus stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and possessed the physical presence and aggressive personality that had earned him the nickname the Gorilla. His early career in the Church had focused on Vatican security and papal travel arrangements, roles that demonstrated his organizational abilities while keeping him away from traditional theological or pastoral responsibilities. Pope Paul VI's decision to place Marcinkus in charge of Vatican finances reflected the Church's recognition that it needed someone who understood modern business practices and could navigate the complex world of international finance. The Vatican's traditional approach to money management, conservative investments in Italian government bonds and real estate, was no longer adequate for an institution that needed to support a global religious organization and fund extensive charitable activities. More importantly, the Church faced new political threats that required sophisticated financial responses. Socialist and communist governments throughout Europe were nationalizing church property and restricting religious activities, while inflation was eroding the value of traditional investments. The Vatican needed financial strategies that could protect church assets while generating the income necessary to maintain its global operations. Marcinkus's first major decision was to seek advice from Michele Sindona, the Sicilian financier who had impressed Vatican officials with his apparent success in international finance. Sindona convinced Marcinkus that the Church needed to modernize its investment portfolio by diversifying into international markets and using sophisticated financial techniques to maximize returns. What Marcinkus didn't understand, or chose not to understand, was that Sindona's expertise came from his involvement in money laundering for the Sicilian Mafia and his manipulation of offshore banking networks. By accepting Sindona's advice and placing Vatican funds under his management, Marcinkus was unknowingly making the Church a partner in one of the most sophisticated criminal financial operations in history. The relationship between Marcinkus and Sindona deepened when they were introduced to Roberto Calvi at Banco Ambrosiano. The three men formed a partnership that would prove mutually beneficial for nearly 2 decades, even as it drew the Vatican deeper into the world of international financial crime. Calvi offered Marcinkus something that the Vatican desperately needed: a sophisticated understanding of how to move money across international borders without attracting regulatory attention. The Church's global operations required constant transfers of funds between different countries, many of which had currency controls and reporting requirements that could complicate legitimate transactions. Through Banco Ambrosiano's network of offshore subsidiaries, Calvi could facilitate Vatican transactions through jurisdictions where banking secrecy laws prevented authorities from monitoring financial flows. Money could be moved from Vatican accounts in Rome to shell companies in Panama, then transferred to banks in Switzerland or Luxembourg, then invested in securities traded in London or New York, all while maintaining the appearance of legitimate investment activity. More controversially, Calvi's offshore network provided the Vatican with the ability to support anti-communist movements in Eastern Europe without violating the neutrality that the Church maintained in public. Vatican money flowed through Banco Ambrosiano's shell companies to fund everything from underground publications in Poland to resistance movements in Czechoslovakia and Hungary. The Church's involvement in these covert operations reflected Pope John Paul II's personal commitment to opposing communist rule in Eastern Europe, particularly in his native Poland. After his election in 1978, the Polish Pope made the liberation of Eastern Europe from communist control a central goal of his papacy, and he was willing to use the Vatican's financial resources to support groups working toward that objective. Calvi's network proved particularly valuable for funding the Solidarity trade union movement in Poland, which represented the most significant threat to communist rule in Eastern Europe. Vatican money, routed through Banco Ambrosiano's offshore companies, provided crucial support for Solidarity's activities, while maintaining plausible deniability for the Church's involvement. But the most lucrative aspect of the Vatican's relationship with Calvi involved the Church's role as a minority shareholder in Banco Ambrosiano itself. The Vatican Bank owned 1.6% of Banco Ambrosiano's shares, a holding that provided both financial returns and insider access to the bank's operations. More importantly, Masonic served on the board of directors of several Banco Ambrosiano subsidiaries, giving him direct involvement in the bank's offshore operations. This arrangement provided benefits to all parties involved. The Mafia gained access to sophisticated money laundering services that allowed them to enjoy their profits without fear of confiscation. Sindona and Calvi earned substantial fees for their services while gaining access to enormous amounts of capital that they could use for their own investments. The banks involved earned profits from the various transactions while maintaining plausible deniability about the source of the funds. But Sindona's most audacious move was his cultivation of relationships within the Vatican hierarchy. Through his friendship with Giovanni Battista Montini, who would later become Pope Paul VI, Sindona gained access to the highest levels of the Catholic Church's financial operations. He convinced church officials that he could help them modernize their investment strategies and protect their wealth from communist threats. In 1969, Pope Paul VI placed a substantial portion of the Vatican's investment portfolio under Sindona's control, a decision that would ultimately cost the Church over $240 million. Sindona used Vatican money to finance his expanding banking empire while providing church officials with returns that seemed too good to be true, because they were. Sindona's Vatican connections provided him with more than just money. The Church's moral authority and diplomatic immunity offered protection from investigation, while its global network of institutions provided cover for complex financial transactions. Most importantly, Sindona's role as a Vatican financial advisor gave him access to Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the American-born head of the Vatican Bank, who would become a key partner in future operations. But the arrangement also exposed the Vatican to enormous risks that Marcinkus either didn't understand or chose to ignore. By signing letters of comfort for shell companies that were being used for money laundering, the Church was creating potential legal liability for billions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. More dangerously, the Vatican was becoming dependent on criminal organizations whose interests might not always align with those of the Catholic Church. These risks became apparent in the early 1980s as Italian investigators began examining Banco Ambrosiano's operations and discovering evidence of massive currency law violations. The Bank of Italy found that billions of dollars had been moved through the bank's offshore network in transactions that appeared to have no legitimate business purpose. More troubling, investigators discovered connections between Banco Ambrosiano and the propaganda Jew Masonic Lodge, a secret organization that was plotting to overthrow Italy's democratic government. The Vatican's financial partnership with P2 members raised serious questions about the Church's involvement in political conspiracies aimed at undermining legitimate institutions. As pressure mounted, Marcinkus attempted to distance the Vatican from Banco Ambrosiano's problems by claiming that he had been deceived by Calvi about the true nature of the bank's operations. In meetings with Italian investigators, Marcinkus maintained that he had simply done what Calvi had requested without understanding the implications of his actions. But documentary evidence suggested that Marcinkus was far more knowledgeable about Banco Ambrosiano's operations than he admitted. Internal Vatican Bank correspondence showed that church officials were fully aware that they were participating in complex financial schemes designed to circumvent Italian banking regulations. More damaging still were recordings of conversations between Marcinkus and Calvi in which they discussed specific transactions involving shell companies and offshore banks. These recordings demonstrated that Marcinkus understood exactly what he was helping to facilitate and was actively involved in planning operations designed to move money illegally. When Banco Ambrosiano finally collapsed in 1982 following Calvi's death, investigators discovered that $1.4 billion was missing from the bank's accounts. Much of this money had flowed through Vatican Bank accounts or shell companies that carried Vatican guarantees, creating enormous potential liability for the Church. Faced with criminal charges in Italy and potential lawsuits from Banco Ambrosiano's creditors, the Vatican initially attempted to deny any legal responsibility for the bank's collapse. Church lawyers argued that the letters of comfort signed by Marcinkus were meaningless documents that created no legal obligations for the Vatican. But this position became increasingly difficult to maintain, as evidence mounted of the Vatican's deep involvement in Banco Ambrosiano's operations. Internal church documents showed that Vatican officials had earned millions of dollars from their partnership with Calvi, while knowingly participating in schemes designed to violate Italian law. Ultimately, the Vatican agreed to pay $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors in what it characterized as a gesture of moral responsibility rather than legal liability. The settlement allowed the Church to avoid criminal prosecution while ending the most damaging financial scandal in modern Vatican history. For Marcinkus personally, the scandal marked the end of his career as a Vatican power broker. Although he avoided criminal prosecution due to Vatican diplomatic immunity, he was effectively exiled within the Church hierarchy and eventually retired to Arizona, where he maintained his silence about Vatican financial operations until his death in 2006. The Vatican Bank scandal revealed the extent to which the Catholic Church had compromised its moral authority in pursuit of financial gain. More broadly, it demonstrated how easily legitimate institutions could be corrupted when their leaders prioritized profit over principles and chose to ask no questions about the source of their partners' wealth. The revelation of propaganda due's existence in 1981 exposed one of the most ambitious political conspiracies in modern European history, a secret organization that aimed to transform Italy from a democracy into an authoritarian state controlled by a shadow network of Masonic initiates. At the center of this conspiracy was Licio Gelli, a charismatic businessman who had built P2 into what investigators would later describe as a state within a state. Licio Gelli's path to becoming Italy's most powerful shadow figure began during World War II, when he demonstrated a remarkable ability to serve multiple masters simultaneously. As a teenage fascist volunteer, he fought with Franco's forces in the Spanish Civil War, then returned to Italy, where he worked for both the SS and the Italian resistance, sometimes on the same day. This early experience taught him that survival required flexibility and that true power came from maintaining relationships with all sides in any conflict. After the war, Gelli fled to Argentina, where he established connections with former Nazis and right-wing military officers who would later participate in the dirty war against leftist political movements. His associates included Klaus Barbie, the former Gestapo chief known as the Butcher of Lyon, who had escaped to South America with the help of American intelligence agencies. Through Barbie, Gelli gained access to international networks involved in arms trafficking, money laundering, and political assassination. Gelli returned to Italy in the 1960s with valuable connections and a clear understanding of how clandestine organizations could influence legitimate political institutions. He joined the Grand Orient of Italy, the country's largest Masonic organization, and quickly identified an opportunity to transform an obscure Masonic lodge into something far more ambitious than traditional Freemasonry. Propaganda Due had originally been founded in 1877 as a lodge for prominent Italians who needed to keep their Masonic membership secret from the Catholic Church, which officially prohibited Catholics from joining Masonic organizations. By the 1960s, the lodge was largely inactive, which made it perfect for Jelly's purposes. He could use the existing Masonic structure while building something entirely different underneath. Jelly's vision for P2 went far beyond traditional Masonic activities like charity work and philosophical discussions. He wanted to create a secret network that could coordinate the activities of Italy's most powerful individuals in pursuit of specific political objectives. His ultimate goal was to prevent communist parties from gaining power in Italy, while establishing a more authoritarian form of government that would be friendlier to business interests and anti-communist forces. The lodge's membership strategy reflected Jelly's sophisticated understanding of how power operated in modern Italy. Rather than recruiting based on ideology, P2 sought to enroll individuals who held key positions in government, business, media, and the military. Members included cabinet ministers, judges, generals, intelligence officials, bank presidents, and media owners, essentially anyone who could influence Italian political and economic life. The recruitment process was highly selective and carefully orchestrated. Potential members were approached only after extensive background investigations, and initiation ceremonies were designed to create a sense of shared destiny and mutual obligation among participants. Members were organized into cells that limited their knowledge of other participants, while only Jelly himself knew the complete membership roster. Roberto Calvi's recruitment into P2 in 1980 reflected both his growing importance in international finance and the lodge's need for sophisticated money laundering capabilities. Calvi's banking expertise and offshore networks made him invaluable for moving money to support P2's political activities while maintaining the secrecy necessary for such operations. Through Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano, P2 gained access to a sophisticated international financial infrastructure that could support a wide range of covert activities. The lodge used the bank's offshore subsidiaries to fund right-wing political movements throughout Latin America, purchase weapons for anti-communist groups, and maintain secret accounts for its members who needed to move money without government detection. More ambitiously, P2 used Banco Ambrosiano's network to finance terrorist attacks designed to destabilize Italian democracy and create conditions for authoritarian rule. The lodge was directly implicated in the 1980 bombing of Bologna's Central Railway Station, which killed 85 people and wounded over 200 others. The attack was designed to increase public fears about political instability and create support for more authoritarian security measures. P2's political strategy was based on the strategy of tension, a doctrine developed by right-wing strategists who believed that democratic governments could be overthrown by creating enough chaos and fear to make citizens demand authoritarian solutions. By sponsoring terrorist attacks that could be blamed on leftist groups, P2 hoped to discredit communist and socialist parties while positioning conservative politicians as the only viable alternative. The lodge's influence extended throughout Italian institutions in ways that made democratic governance virtually impossible. P2 members in the judiciary could ensure that investigations were misdirected or terminated, while members in intelligence agencies could provide advance warning of government activities. Media owners, who were P2 members, could shape public opinion, while military officers could sabotage operations deemed contrary to the lodge's interests. Perhaps most significantly, P2's membership included senior officials in Italy's intelligence services, who provided the lodge with access to classified information and the ability to conduct sophisticated surveillance operations. These capabilities allowed P2 to monitor potential threats to its activities while gathering compromising information that could be used to recruit new members or silence critics. The lodge's international connections were equally impressive. P2 maintained relationships with intelligence agencies throughout NATO countries, right-wing organizations in Latin America, and exile communities from Eastern European communist states. These connections allowed the lodge to coordinate its activities with broader international efforts to combat communist influence, while providing access to resources that far exceeded what any purely domestic organization could command. Gelli's personal relationships were particularly important for P2's international operations. His friendship with Juan Perón had given him access to Argentine military and intelligence networks, while his connections with Klaus Barbie provided links to former Nazi networks and international arms dealers. Through these relationships, P2 could access weapons, financing, and operational expertise that supported its activities throughout Europe and Latin America. The Lodge's plans for transforming Italian democracy were outlined in a document called the Plan for Democratic Rebirth that was discovered when police raided Gelli's villa in 1981. The plan called for rewriting the Italian constitution to reduce the power of parliament and political parties while strengthening executive authority. It also proposed consolidating media ownership, suppressing trade union activities, and establishing more centralized control over local government. More ominously, the plan included provisions for dealing with political opposition through surveillance, intimidation, and, if necessary, elimination. P2 maintained detailed files on thousands of Italian politicians, judges, journalists, and activists, information that could be used for blackmail or to target individuals for more direct action. The discovery of P2's existence in 1981 sent shockwaves through Italian society and brought down the government of Prime Minister Arnaldo Forlani. The membership list found in Gelli's villa included 962 prominent Italians, including 3 cabinet ministers, 43 members of parliament, 43 generals, 8 admirals, the heads of all 3 intelligence services, the heads of major banks, and prominent media figures, including a young Silvio Berlusconi. But the most damaging revelations concerned P2's involvement in some of Italy's most traumatic recent events. Investigations revealed that Lodge members had been involved in covering up the true perpetrators of the Bologna bombing, misdirecting investigations into the kidnapping and murder of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro, and manipulating public information about various terrorist attacks throughout the 1970s. The P2 scandal also exposed the Lodge's connections to the Vatican Bank scandal and Roberto Calvi's money laundering operations. Investigators discovered that several P2 members had benefited financially from Banco Ambrosiano's offshore transactions, while the Lodge had used Vatican money to finance some of its political activities. For Calvi, the exposure of P2 represented both a personal catastrophe and a professional disaster. His membership in the Lodge made him a target for investigation by magistrates who were determined to understand how P2 had corrupted Italian institutions. More dangerously, it revealed his connections to organizations and individuals who were willing to use violence to achieve their political objectives. As investigations into P2 intensified, Calvi found himself caught between competing pressures that would ultimately prove impossible to manage. Italian authorities demanded information about the Lodge's financial activities, while P2 members insisted that he maintain the secrecy that had protected them for decades. The Vatican wanted reassurance that its involvement with Banco Ambrosiano wouldn't be exposed, while the Mafia demanded the return of money that had been lost in the bank's increasingly desperate financial manipulations. The collapse of P2's secrecy also exposed Calvi to new threats from former associates who feared that he might reveal their involvement in criminal activities to save himself. As the only person with complete knowledge of how money had flowed between P2, the Vatican, the Mafia, and various international networks, Calvi possessed information that could destroy the careers and freedom of some of the most powerful people in Europe. By 1982, it had become clear that the P2 scandal would not simply fade away, as many Lodge members had hoped. Parliamentary investigations were exposing new details about the organization's activities, while magistrates were pursuing criminal charges against several prominent members. For those who had built their power on secrecy and deniability, Calvi's detailed knowledge of P2's financial operations represented an existential threat that could only be eliminated by eliminating Calvi himself. By the late 1970s, Roberto Calvi had transformed Banco Ambrosiano from a conservative Catholic bank into the centerpiece of the most sophisticated money laundering operation in history. Through a network of offshore subsidiaries spanning 3 continents, Calvi moved billions of dollars for clients ranging from Sicilian drug lords to Vatican cardinals, from CIA operatives to terrorist organizations, all while maintaining the appearance of legitimate international banking. The foundation of Calvi's money laundering empire was his mastery of regulatory arbitrage, the practice of exploiting differences between banking laws in different countries to facilitate transactions that would be illegal if conducted within a single jurisdiction. By the 1970s, the international financial system had become complex enough that sophisticated operators could move money through multiple jurisdictions in ways that made it virtually impossible for authorities to track the original source of funds. Calvi's network began with Banco Ambrosiano's subsidiary in Nassau, the Bahamas, which operated under banking laws that required minimal reporting and provided extensive secrecy protections. Money could be deposited in Italy, transferred to Nassau, where its origins were obscured by Bahamian bank secrecy laws, then moved to other jurisdictions for investment or further laundering. But the Nassau operation was only the beginning. Calvi established subsidiary banks and finance companies in Luxembourg, Switzerland, Panama, Peru, and Nicaragua, each chosen for specific advantages in the global money laundering process. Luxembourg provided access to the European financial system while maintaining strict banking secrecy. Switzerland offered ultimate discretion and sophisticated investment services. Panama provided anonymous shell companies that could own assets without revealing their true controllers. The jewel in Calvi's offshore crown was Banco Ambrosiano overseas, in Nassau, which became the primary vehicle for moving money between his various international operations. Under Bahamian law, the bank could accept deposits and make loans without revealing details to any foreign government, while its status as a subsidiary of a major European bank gave it credibility with international financial institutions. Through Banco Ambrosiano overseas, Calvi created a network of shell companies with names like Astolfine S.A., Bellatrix S.A., and Starfield S.A. that existed only as brass nameplate companies in Panama City law offices. These companies had no employees, no business activities, and no assets other than bank accounts, but they could own other companies, enter into contracts, and conduct financial transactions that would be impossible to trace back to their real controllers. The sophistication of Calvi's money laundering operations reflected both his technical expertise and his understanding of how international organized crime was evolving in the 1970s. The Sicilian Mafia's entry into heroin trafficking had created unprecedented wealth that needed to be laundered through legitimate financial institutions. While the globalization of organized crime required money laundering services that could operate across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, Calvi's primary mafia client was the Cosa Nostra family, headed by Giuseppe Calò, known as Pippo the Cashier, for his role in managing the organization's financial affairs. Calò understood that the massive profits generated by heroin trafficking could only be enjoyed if they could be successfully laundered through legitimate businesses, and he recognized that Calvi's banking network provided the perfect solution. The process for laundering mafia money was elegant in its simplicity. Cash generated by heroin sales in New York would be deposited in American banks controlled by mafia associates, then transferred to Banco Ambrosiano overseas in Nassau as payment for fictitious business transactions. The money would then be moved through various shell companies before being invested in legitimate businesses or real estate in Italy, Switzerland, or other European countries. But Calvi's services went far beyond simple money laundering. He also provided the mafia with access to legitimate credit markets, allowing them to finance major business acquisitions without using their own cash reserves. Through complex financial arrangements involving his offshore companies, Calvi could make it appear that mafia-controlled businesses were being purchased with funds borrowed from legitimate banks rather than with the proceeds of drug trafficking. More sophisticated still were Calvi's currency manipulation schemes, which allowed his clients to profit from exchange rate fluctuations while moving money internationally. By simultaneously buying and selling the same currency in different markets, Calvi could create artificial profits that justified large international transfers while obscuring the original source of the funds being moved. These operations generated enormous profits for all parties involved. Banco Ambrosiano earned substantial fees for its services, while Calvi personally benefited from his insider knowledge of major financial transactions. The mafia gained access to sophisticated financial services that allowed them to enjoy their criminal profits without fear of confiscation, while corrupt officials throughout the network received payments for their cooperation. But the most lucrative aspect of Calvi's operations involved his relationships with intelligence agencies, that needed to move money for covert operations without leaving official paper trails. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, the CIA was conducting extensive covert operations in Latin America, designed to prevent leftist governments from coming to power or to support right-wing groups fighting against established leftist regimes. These operations required massive amounts of funding that couldn't be provided through official government channels without congressional oversight and public accountability. Calvi's offshore network provided the perfect solution. CIA money could be moved through Banco Ambrosiano's shell companies to appear as private investment in Latin American businesses, while actually funding everything from weapons purchases to political assassinations. The most significant of these operations involved supporting the Contra rebels fighting against Nicaragua's Sandinista government. Beginning in 1979, substantial amounts of money flowed through Banco Ambrosiano's Nicaraguan subsidiary to finance Contra activities, while other funds were used to purchase weapons from international arms dealers and to bribe Central American officials who provided logistical support for the rebels. Similarly, Calvi's network was used to channel funding to right-wing military forces in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, who were fighting against leftist insurgencies with unofficial American support. Money moved through Panamanian shell companies to appear as private business investment, while actually paying for weapons, training, and operational expenses for military units that were committing some of the worst human rights abuses in the hemisphere. The Vatican's involvement in these operations reflected Pope John Paul II's personal commitment to opposing communist expansion, particularly in Eastern Europe and Latin America. Church officials convinced themselves that they were supporting legitimate anti-communist resistance movements, even when their money was actually funding organizations that engaged in terrorism and mass murder. Vatican money was particularly important for financing solidarity trade union activities in Poland, which represented the most significant challenge to communist rule in Eastern Europe. Funds moved from Vatican Bank accounts to Banco Ambrosiano shell companies in Panama, then to banks in Western Europe, where they were converted into hard currency that could be smuggled into Poland to support union organizing activities. But Vatican money also supported more controversial operations, including funding for right-wing organizations in Latin America that claimed to be fighting against communist influence, but were actually engaged in drug trafficking and political assassination. Church officials either didn't know or chose not to ask about these activities, preferring to maintain plausible deniability about how their money was being used. The complexity of Calvi's operations reached its peak in the early 1980s when he was simultaneously managing money for the Vatican, the Mafia, P2, and various intelligence agencies, while trying to prevent Italian banking authorities from discovering the true nature of his activities. The various shell companies in his network were borrowing money from each other in circular transactions, designed to create the appearance of legitimate business activity, while actually moving money for illegal purposes. By 1981, these operations had become so complex that even Calvi was losing track of how money was flowing through his network. Banco Ambrosiano was lending hundreds of millions of dollars to Panamanian companies that had no apparent business activities, while these same companies were using the borrowed money to purchase shares in other Banco Ambrosiano subsidiaries in circular transactions that created the appearance of capital investment, while actually representing massive currency law violations. More dangerously, Calvi had begun using depositors' money to finance his money laundering operations, creating enormous risks for ordinary bank customers who had no knowledge of the illegal activities being conducted through their bank. When Italian authorities began examining Banco Ambrosiano's books in 1981, they discovered that the bank was technically insolvent, with liabilities far exceeding its assets. The discovery of these problems created a crisis that Calvi proved incapable of managing. His clients, the Mafia, the Vatican, P2, and various intelligence agencies all demanded the return of their money, but Calvi had already spent or lost much of it in increasingly desperate attempts to keep his operations functioning. Faced with exposure and potential prosecution, he began threatening to reveal the details of his money laundering operations unless his former partners provided the funds needed to prevent Banco Ambrosiano's collapse. These threats sealed Calvi's fate. The various organizations that had benefited from his services for over a decade suddenly realized that their former partner had become their greatest threat, Calvi possessed detailed knowledge of criminal activities involving some of the most powerful organizations in the world, and he was desperate enough to use that knowledge to save himself. The decision to eliminate Calvi was probably made collectively by representatives of the Mafia, P2, and possibly the Vatican, though the exact details of this conspiracy remain unknown. What is clear is that by June 1982, multiple criminal organizations had concluded that Roberto Calvi was too dangerous to remain alive. His death would serve as both a punishment for his betrayal and a warning to others who might consider revealing the secrets of the international criminal conspiracy he had helped create. The unraveling of Roberto Calvi's criminal empire began in 1978, when the Bank of Italy launched what appeared to be a routine inspection of Banco Ambrosiano's books. What investigators found, however, was evidence of financial irregularities so massive and systematic that they could only be explained by deliberate criminal conspiracy. The discovery of $27 million in illegal currency transfers marked the beginning of a 4-year investigation that would expose the largest banking scandal in Italian history. The Bank of Italy's investigation was led by a team of financial inspectors who specialized in detecting currency law violations, a particularly important concern in a country where capital flight was undermining economic stability and tax evasion was endemic among wealthy individuals and corporations. Italy's strict currency controls required banks to report international transfers above certain thresholds and prohibited unauthorized movement of funds to offshore jurisdictions. What the inspectors discovered at Banco Ambrosiano was a sophisticated system for circumventing these controls through a network of offshore subsidiaries and shell companies that made it virtually impossible to trace the ultimate destination of transferred funds. Money would leave Italy as apparently legitimate business transactions pass through multiple offshore jurisdictions where its origins were obscured, then merge as untraceable investments in foreign securities or real estate. The scope of the violations was staggering. Between 1975 and 1978 alone, investigators found evidence of over $200 million in unauthorized currency transfers, sums that represented a significant portion of the bank's total assets. More troubling still, many of these transfers appeared to have no legitimate business purpose, suggesting that Banco Ambrosiano was being used primarily as a money laundering vehicle rather than a legitimate commercial bank. Bank of Italy inspectors were particularly concerned about the role of Banco Ambrosiano overseas, the bank's Nassau subsidiary, which appeared to be conducting far more business and could be justified by the Bahamas' small economy. Transactions flowing through Nassau involved hundreds of millions of dollars, yet the subsidiary's reported business activities were minimal, and its staff consisted of only a handful of employees. When inspectors requested detailed records of the Nassau subsidiary's operations, they encountered systematic obstruction from Banco Ambrosiano officials who claimed that Bahamian banking secrecy laws prevented them from providing the requested information. This response only heightened investigators' suspicions that the Nassau operation was being used for illegal purposes. The investigation took a dramatic turn in 1979 when Bank of Italy officials discovered documentary evidence linking Banco Ambrosiano to Michele Sindona, the disgraced financier who was facing criminal charges in both Italy and the United States for his role in the collapse of Franklin National Bank. The discovery of these connections revealed that Calvi's money laundering operations were part of a much larger criminal conspiracy involving some of the most dangerous figures in international finance. More damaging still were documents showing that Banco Ambrosiano had provided funding to various Sindona enterprises even after American authorities had identified him as a major figure in organized crime money laundering. These transactions suggested that Calvi was knowingly participating in criminal activities rather than simply being deceived by a trusted business partner. As evidence mounted, Bank of Italy officials realized that they were dealing with something far more serious than routine currency law violations. The patterns they were discovering suggested that Banco Ambrosiano was serving as a central node in an international money laundering network that involved organized crime, corrupt political figures, and possibly foreign intelligence agencies. In May 1981, the Bank of Italy formally referred the case to Milan prosecutor Giuliano Turoni, who specialized in financial crimes and had already developed a reputation for pursuing cases against powerful individuals, regardless of their political connections. Turone's investigation quickly expanded beyond currency law violations to include charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The criminal investigation faced immediate obstacles as Calvi's political connections attempted to limit the scope of the inquiry and protect him from prosecution. Several prominent politicians who had received campaign contributions from Banco Ambrosiano lobbied prosecutors to treat the case as a minor regulatory violation rather than a serious criminal matter. More significantly, Calvi's membership in Propaganda Due provided him with advance warning of investigative developments through P2 members who held senior positions in Italy's judiciary and law enforcement agencies. This inside information allowed Calvi to destroy or alter documents before they could be seized by investigators, while also providing him with opportunities to coordinate his legal strategy with other criminal defendants. But Prosecutor Turone proved impossible to intimidate or corrupt. His investigation methodically pieced together evidence of Calvi's criminal activities while building legal cases that could withstand the political pressure that was certain to follow. By late 1981, Turone had assembled enough evidence to seek Calvi's arrest on charges of violating currency laws, fraud, and conspiracy. The arrest warrant, issued in May 1981, marked the first time that a major Italian banker had been charged with criminal activities related to money laundering and offshore financial manipulation. The charges alleged that Calvi had systematically violated Italian banking laws over a period of several years, illegally transferring hundreds of millions of dollars to offshore jurisdictions while concealing these activities from regulatory authorities. More specifically, the indictment alleged that Calvi had used Banco Ambrosiano's offshore subsidiaries to facilitate currency law violations by wealthy clients who wanted to move money out of Italy without paying required taxes or obtaining necessary permits. The prosecution argued that these activities constituted a criminal conspiracy that had defrauded the Italian state of substantial tax revenues while undermining the stability of the national currency. When Calvi was arrested at Milan's Linnaeus airport in May 1981, he initially maintained that he was the victim of a political persecution designed to discredit successful Italian businesses. His lawyers argued that the transactions in question were legitimate international business activities that had been mischaracterized by prosecutors who didn't understand modern banking practices. But this defense became increasingly difficult to maintain as investigators uncovered evidence of Calvi's connections to organized crime figures and his membership in Propaganda Due. The discovery of P2's membership lists in Liceo Gelli's villa in March 1981 had revealed that many of Italy's most prominent citizens were involved in a secret organization dedicated to undermining democratic institutions. The P2 revelations created a political crisis that made it impossible for Calvi's supporters to defend him publicly without exposing themselves to accusations of involvement in the conspiracy. Politicians who had previously been willing to intervene on Calvi's behalf suddenly found themselves under investigation for their own connections to the secret lodge. During his 2 months in Milan's San Vittore prison, Calvi's behavior suggested that he was under enormous psychological pressure. Guards reported that he appeared depressed and fearful, often spending long periods staring at the walls of his cell without speaking. He repeatedly requested meetings with magistrates, claiming that he had important information to share about political corruption and criminal activities. But when prosecutors met with Calvi, they found that he was unwilling to provide the detailed information they needed to pursue broader investigations. Instead, he offered only vague hints about criminal activities, while demanding guarantees of reduced sentences and protection from retaliation by his former associates. Calvi's trial began in July 1981 and quickly became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Italian history. The case attracted international attention due to its connections to the Vatican Bank scandal and the P2 conspiracy, while domestic media coverage focused on the implications for Italy's banking system and political institutions. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Calvi had systematically violated Italian currency laws by facilitating unauthorized transfers of hundreds of millions of dollars to offshore jurisdictions. These violations constituted serious crimes that had undermined Italy's economic sovereignty while enriching Calvi and his criminal associates at the expense of legitimate businesses and taxpayers. Calvi's defense team, led by some of Italy's most prominent criminal lawyers, argued that their client had been conducting legitimate international banking activities that were standard practice among major European financial institutions. They contended that Italian currency laws were outdated and impractical for banks that needed to compete in global financial markets. More controversially, the defense argued that Calvi was being prosecuted for political reasons by magistrates who were opposed to successful capitalism and wanted to discredit Italy's financial sector. This argument reflected the broader political tensions of the period, when Italy's business community was increasingly critical of what they viewed as excessive government regulation and judicial interference in commercial activities. The trial's outcome was decided by Judge Emilio Alessandrini, who had built a reputation as an incorruptible magistrate willing to pursue cases against powerful defendants regardless of their political connections. Alessandrini carefully reviewed the evidence against Calvi, while rejecting defense arguments that sought to minimize the seriousness of the charges. In July 1981, Judge Alessandrini convicted Calvi on all charges and sentenced him to 4 years in prison, plus a fine of 16 billion lira, approximately $20 million. The sentence was suspended pending appeal, allowing Calvi to remain free while his lawyers challenged the conviction in higher courts. The conviction represented a personal catastrophe for Calvi, who had spent his entire career cultivating an image as a respectable banker and pillar of Milan's Catholic business community. More practically, it exposed him to potential retaliation from criminal associates who feared that he might cooperate with prosecutors to reduce his sentence. But the most serious consequence of Calvi's legal troubles was the way they exposed the instability of his entire financial empire. As details of the criminal investigation became public, international banking partners began questioning their relationships with Banco Ambrosiano, while depositors grew concerned about the safety of their funds. These concerns proved justified when subsequent investigations revealed that Calvi's legal problems were only the visible tip of a much larger crisis involving billions of dollars in missing funds, fraudulent transactions, and connections to international organized crime. The man who had spent 2 decades building one of Europe's most powerful financial empires was about to watch it collapse around him, as his former partners decided that Roberto Calvi had become too dangerous to remain alive. By the spring of 1982, Roberto Calvi found himself trapped in an impossible situation, as multiple investigations closed in on his criminal empire, while former partners in the Mafia, the Vatican, and Propaganda Jew began demanding the return of money that no longer existed. The convergence of legal, financial, and criminal pressures created a perfect storm that would ultimately drive Calvi to flee Italy in a desperate attempt to negotiate with his creditors and save his own life. The immediate trigger for Calvi's crisis was the Bank of Italy's discovery in May 1982 that Banco Ambrosiano was technically insolvent, with liabilities exceeding assets by over $1.3 billion. This devastating finding was the result of investigators' growing understanding of how Calvi had used depositors' money to finance his money laundering operations, while concealing these activities through fraudulent accounting practices. The Bank of Italy's investigation revealed that Banco Ambrosiano had made enormous loans to Panamanian shell companies that existed only on paper and had no apparent means of repaying their debts. These loans, which totaled over $1.4 billion, had been secured only by Vatican Bank letters of comfort that Italian authorities now realized were legally worthless. More troubling still was the discovery that many of these loans had been made to finance circular transactions designed to inflate Banco Ambrosiano's apparent assets, while actually moving money out of Italy in violation of currency laws. The bank had been lending money to offshore companies that used the funds to purchase shares in other Banco Ambrosiano subsidiaries, creating the illusion of profitable international business activities, while actually facilitating massive fraud. As news of these discoveries leaked to the press, Banco Ambrosiano faced a classic bank run as depositors rushed to withdraw their funds before the institution collapsed completely. The bank's stock price plummeted, while international credit markets refused to provide the emergency funding that might have prevented insolvency. But Calvi's problems extended far beyond the legitimate banking authorities who were investigating his currency law violations. His most dangerous creditors were criminal organizations that had entrusted him with billions of dollars and were now demanding immediate repayment regardless of his legal difficulties. Giuseppe Callo, The Sicilian Mafia leader known as Pippo the Cashier was particularly furious about Banco Ambrosiano's collapse because it threatened the loss of approximately $50 million in mafia money that had been laundered through the bank's offshore network. Calvo had built his reputation within Cosa Nostra as a reliable financial manager who could protect the organization's assets from government seizure, and Calvi's failures threatened to destroy that reputation. Making matters worse, other mafia families had begun questioning Calvo's judgment in trusting Calvi with their money. Internal Cosa Nostra politics were notoriously violent, and leaders who lost the organization's money often paid with their lives. Calvo understood that his own survival might depend on recovering the missing funds, or ensuring that Calvi could never reveal details of their money laundering relationship. The Vatican Bank presented a different, but equally serious threat. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus was facing increasing pressure from Pope John Paul II to resolve the scandals surrounding the Church's involvement with Banco Ambrosiano, while Italian prosecutors were threatening to issue arrest warrants for Vatican officials who had facilitated the bank's illegal activities. Church officials were particularly concerned about the potential exposure of Vatican involvement in funding covert operations in Latin America and Eastern Europe. If Calvi revealed details of how church money had been used to support Contra rebels in Nicaragua or underground movements in Poland, the resulting scandal could severely damage the Vatican's moral authority and political neutrality. More immediately, the Vatican faced potential financial liability for billions of dollars in Banco Ambrosiano debts that were backed by letters of comfort signed by Marcinkus. Italian courts might rule that these letters constituted legally binding guarantees, forcing the Church to pay enormous sums to cover losses created by Calvi's criminal activities. Propaganda due members faced their own existential threats from Calvi's growing legal problems. The exposure of P2's membership and activities had already brought down the Italian government and led to criminal investigations of numerous lodge members. If Calvi revealed details of how P2 had used Banco Ambrosiano to finance terrorist attacks and political conspiracies, the resulting prosecutions could destroy the careers and freedom of hundreds of Italy's most powerful citizens. Lizio Gelli, the lodge's Grand Master, had already fled to Switzerland to avoid arrest, but many other P2 members remained in Italy, where they were vulnerable to prosecution if Calvi decided to cooperate with investigators. These individuals had accumulated enormous power and wealth over decades of secret collaboration, and they were willing to use any means necessary to protect themselves from exposure. Faced with these mounting pressures, Calvi began behaving erratically in the weeks leading up to his flight from Italy. Colleagues noticed that he appeared increasingly paranoid and fearful, often checking his office for listening devices and varying his daily routines to avoid potential surveillance or assassination attempts. On May 27, 1982, Calvi's paranoia appeared to be justified when gunmen attempted to assassinate Roberto Rosone, Banco Ambrosiano's deputy chairman, outside his Milan apartment. Rosen survived the attack, but one of the gunmen was killed when Rosen's bodyguards returned fire. The incident sent a clear message that Calvi's enemies were willing to use violence to prevent exposure of their criminal activities. The attempted assassination of Rosone convinced Calvi that his own life was in immediate danger. He began making desperate attempts to contact former partners who might be willing to provide the funds needed to save Banco Ambrosiano and prevent total collapse of his empire. But these efforts only confirmed that his former allies had become his enemies. Vatican officials refused to meet with Calvi or to provide additional support for Banco Ambrosiano, instead demanding immediate repayment of money the Church had invested in the bank's offshore operations. Mafia representatives made it clear that they expected full recovery of their laundered funds, regardless of Calvi's legal problems. P2 members suggested that Calvi's best option might be to disappear entirely rather than risk exposing the lodge's secrets. On June 5, 1982, Calvi made his final desperate attempt to secure Vatican support by writing a letter directly to Pope John Paul II. The letter warned that Banco Ambrosiano's collapse would create a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions for the Catholic Church and implored the Pope to intervene to prevent disaster. The letter's language was carefully crafted to remind the Vatican of its deep involvement in Banco Ambrosiano's activities without explicitly threatening to expose church secrets. Calvi wrote that the bank's collapse would damage the Church in ways that outsiders could not imagine, a veiled reference to the illegal activities that Vatican money had financed through Banco Ambrosiano's network. But the Pope never responded to Calvi's letter, and Vatican officials made it clear that they considered him a liability rather than a partner. The Church's abandonment of its longtime financial collaborator marked the final collapse of the relationship that had provided Calvi with protection and legitimacy for over 2 decades. Realizing that he had exhausted all options for saving his empire, Calvi began planning his escape from Italy. Through contacts in the Italian intelligence services, he obtained a false passport under the name Roberto Calvi and arranged for transportation that would take him out of the country before authorities could prevent his departure. On June 10, 1982, Calvi left his Rome apartment for the last time and made his way to Venice, where he boarded a private plane that would take him to London via Zurich. His departure was facilitated by Flavio Carboni, a Sardinian businessman with connections to both P2 and organized crime figures who had promised to help Calvi negotiate with his creditors. But Carboni's true loyalties remained unclear, and investigators would later suspect that he was actually working with Calvi's enemies to lure the banker to London, where he could be eliminated without attracting attention from Italian authorities. The complexity of Carboni's relationships with various criminal organizations made it impossible to determine whether he was helping Calvi or betraying him. As Calvi's plane took off from Venice, he was leaving behind the country where he had spent his entire career and the financial empire that had made him one of the most powerful men in international banking. But he was also carrying with him detailed knowledge of criminal conspiracies involving some of the most dangerous organizations in the world, knowledge that would soon make him the target of a murder plot designed to silence him forever. When Calvi arrived in London on June 11, 1982, he believed that he could still negotiate a solution that would save both Banco Ambrosiano and his own life. He had no way of knowing that his enemies had already decided that Roberto Calvi was too dangerous to remain alive, and that they were already implementing plans to ensure that the secrets he carried would die with him under Blackfriars Bridge. The week that followed would be Calvi's last, as the man who had built the most sophisticated money laundering empire in history discovered that criminal organizations show no loyalty to partners who become liabilities. His death would send a message that resonated throughout the international criminal underworld. No one, regardless of their power or knowledge, is indispensable when they threaten the interests of organizations that will kill to protect their secrets. Roberto Calvi's last week alive was a desperate dance between hope and terror as he attempted to negotiate his survival with criminal organizations that had already decided he was too dangerous to live. From his arrival in London on June 11, 1982, until his body was discovered hanging from Blackfriars Bridge 7 days later, Calvi moved through a shadowy world of international criminals, corrupt bankers, and Secret Service operatives who were all playing their own deadly games. Calvi's arrival in London had been arranged by Flavio Carboni, a mysterious Sardinian businessman whose connections spanned the worlds of legitimate business, organized crime, and international intelligence. Carboni presented himself as Calvi's salvation, claiming that he could arrange meetings with potential investors who might provide the funds needed to save Banco Ambrosiano, while protecting Calvi from his increasingly dangerous enemies. But Carboni's true motivations remained opaque, even to those who worked closely with him. He maintained relationships with senior figures in Italian organized crime, including mafia leaders who had lost money through Banco Ambrosiano's collapse. He also had connections to intelligence services and secret organizations that valued his ability to move between legitimate and criminal worlds without attracting unwanted attention. What Calvi didn't realize was that Carboni was simultaneously negotiating with multiple parties who had conflicting interests in the banker's fate. While publicly promising to help Calvi find financial backing, Carboni was also reporting to criminal organizations that wanted assurance that their former partner would never reveal details of their money laundering operations. Calvi's first days in London were spent in a safe house in Chelsea, a modest apartment that provided temporary refuge, while Carboni arranged the meetings that were supposed to secure Calvi's future. The banker's behavior during this period suggested that he understood the extreme danger of his situation, while still hoping that his knowledge and connections might save him. According to witnesses who saw Calvi during his final week, he appeared physically exhausted and emotionally drained by the stress of the previous months. The confident, sophisticated banker, who had once moved effortlessly through the highest levels of international finance, had been reduced to a frightened fugitive dependent on criminal associates for his survival. But Calvi also demonstrated flashes of his former determination, spending hours on the telephone attempting to arrange financial deals that might provide escape from his impossible situation. He contacted potential investors throughout Europe and the Americas, offering them access to his offshore banking network in exchange for the emergency funding that might save Banco Ambrosiano. These conversations revealed the scope of Calvi's desperation and his willingness to reveal previously protected secrets in exchange for assistance. Intelligence services monitoring his calls heard him discussing details of Vatican financial operations, mafia money laundering techniques, and P2 political conspiracies that he had never previously acknowledged publicly. More dangerously, Calvi began threatening to expose these secrets if his former partners didn't provide the support he needed to prevent Banco Ambrosiano's collapse. He told associates that he possessed detailed records of criminal activities involving some of the most powerful organizations in the world, and that he was prepared to turn these records over to law enforcement authorities if necessary to save himself. These threats sealed Calvi's fate. The various criminal organizations that had benefited from his services for over 2 decades suddenly realized that their former partner had become their greatest enemy. Calvi's detailed knowledge of their operations, combined with his growing desperation, made him an existential threat that could only be eliminated through his death. The decision to murder Calvi was probably made collectively by representatives of the Sicilian Mafia, propaganda due, and possibly Vatican officials who feared exposure of their involvement in illegal activities. While the exact details of this conspiracy remain unknown, investigators believe that multiple criminal organizations coordinated their efforts to ensure that Calvi would never have the opportunity to reveal their secrets. Giuseppe Calò, the mafia leader who had lost millions of dollars through Banco Ambrosiano's collapse, was particularly motivated to silence Calvi permanently. Calò understood that Cosa Nostra's survival depended on maintaining omertà, the code of silence that prevented law enforcement from understanding the organization's operations. Calvi's threats to reveal details of mafia money laundering represented a direct challenge to this fundamental principle. P2 members faced equally serious threats from Calvi's potential revelations. The secret lodge had already been exposed and disbanded, but many of its most powerful members remained in positions of authority throughout Italian society. If Calvi revealed details of how P2 had used Banco Ambrosiano to finance terrorist attacks and political conspiracies, the resulting prosecutions could destroy hundreds of careers while exposing the full scope of the lodge's criminal activities. Vatican officials confronted the possibility that Calvi might reveal how church money had been used to finance covert operations that violated both Italian law and Vatican neutrality. Such revelations could severely damage the Church's moral authority, while creating legal liability for billions of dollars in illegal transactions. On June 15, 1982, 3 days before his death, Calvi's situation became even more desperate when the Bank of Italy formally revoked his authority as chairman of Banco Ambrosiano. This action effectively ended any possibility that he might regain control of his financial empire, while confirming that Italian authorities considered him a criminal rather than a legitimate banker. The same day, Calvi received devastating news when his longtime secretary, Graziella Coroscia, committed suicide by jumping from the 5th floor of Banco Ambrosiano's headquarters in Milan. Coroscia left behind a note condemning Calvi for the damage he had caused to the bank and its employees, a final repudiation from someone who had worked closely with him for many years. Coroscia's suicide eliminated one of the few people who possessed detailed knowledge of Calvi's criminal activities, while also demonstrating the human cost of his illegal operations. For Calvi, her death represented both a personal tragedy and a practical problem, as he had been hoping that she might provide testimony that could help his legal defense. As his situation deteriorated, Calvi became increasingly paranoid about his personal safety. Associates noticed that he frequently changed his location within London and varied his daily routines to avoid potential surveillance. He expressed particular concern about being followed by unknown individuals who might be working for his enemies. But Calvi's attempts to avoid surveillance were ultimately futile. The criminal organizations pursuing him possessed sophisticated intelligence capabilities that included access to corrupt law enforcement officials and private investigators who could track his movements throughout London. More importantly, his dependence on Flavio Carboni for protection meant that his location was always known to individuals whose loyalties remained questionable. On the evening of June 17, 1982, Calvi's final day alive, he met with Carboni and other associates to discuss a potential deal that might provide emergency funding for Banco Ambrosiano. The details of these negotiations remain unclear, but participants later claimed that Calvi appeared optimistic about finding a solution to his financial problems. What Calvi didn't understand was that these meetings were actually being used to confirm final arrangements for his assassination. While he believed he was negotiating for his survival, his enemies were completing plans that would ensure his death within hours. According to the reconstruction later developed by investigators, Calvi left his Chelsea safe house sometime after midnight on June 18, 1982, believing that he was going to meet potential investors who might save his empire. Instead, he was taken to Blackfriars Bridge, where he was murdered by professional assassins who staged his death to appear like suicide. The choice of Blackfriars Bridge was not accidental. The location's name carried symbolic significance for members of Propaganda Due, who called themselves Frati Neri or Blackfriars. Calvi's murder at this location was intended as a warning to other P2 members about the consequences of betraying the lodge's secrets. The method of murder, hanging with bricks stuffed in his pockets, was designed to make Calvi's death appear like suicide, while also carrying symbolic meaning within criminal culture. The bricks were meant to weight down his body, while their placement in his clothing was intended to suggest shame and defeat. When postal worker Robert Johnson discovered Calvi's body hanging from scaffolding under Blackfriars Bridge at 7:30 a.m. on June 18, 1982, he was looking at the corpse of a man who had possessed detailed knowledge of some of the largest criminal conspiracies in modern history. Calvi's death ensured that these secrets would remain buried at least temporarily, while sending a clear message to others who might consider betraying criminal organizations that had the power to kill even the most protected individuals. The discovery of Calvi's body marked the end of one of the most complex criminal careers in financial history, but it also marked the beginning of investigations that would eventually expose much of what Calvi had taken to his grave. Although his killers succeeded in silencing him permanently, they could not prevent the eventual revelation of the criminal empire he had helped create and the international conspiracy that had ultimately destroyed him. The discovery of Roberto Calvi's body hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge on the morning of June 18, 1982, immediately presented London's Metropolitan Police with one of the most complex murder investigations in British criminal history. What appeared at first glance to be a straightforward suicide would eventually expose an international conspiracy involving the Vatican, the Sicilian Mafia, and secret societies that reached into the highest levels of European society. The initial response to Calvi's death reflected the assumptions of investigating officers who saw what appeared to be clear evidence of suicide. The banker's body was found hanging from orange rope attached to scaffolding beneath the bridge, with his pockets stuffed with bricks and cash, totaling nearly £10,000 in 3 different currencies. His expensive business suit was intact, and there were no obvious signs of struggle or violence that might suggest murder. Detective Chief Inspector Trevor Smith, who led the initial investigation, later admitted that police officers made crucial errors in their examination of the crime scene. Most significantly, they untied the rope from Calvi's neck rather than cutting it, thereby destroying potential forensic evidence that might have revealed whether the knot had been tied by Calvi himself or by someone else. The decision to untie rather than cut the rope reflected investigators' initial assumption that they were dealing with a suicide rather than a homicide. This assumption was reinforced by Calvi's obvious financial problems and legal difficulties, which provided an apparent motive for self-destruction. The presence of large amounts of cash in multiple currencies suggested that he had been planning to flee somewhere, while the dramatic location seemed consistent with someone seeking to make a final statement. The first coroner's inquest, held in July 1982, formally ruled Calvi's death a suicide, based on the physical evidence and the banker's desperate circumstances. Coroner David Paul concluded that Calvi had killed himself, while the balance of his mind was disturbed by the collapse of his financial empire and the criminal charges he was facing in Italy. But this verdict was immediately challenged by Calvi's family, who hired prominent barrister George Carman QC to represent their interests in demanding a more thorough investigation. The family's objections were based partly on religious grounds. Calvi was a devout Catholic who would have considered suicide a mortal sin, but also on practical considerations about the physical evidence at the scene. Calvi's son Carlo, who would spend decades investigating his father's death, pointed out numerous inconsistencies in the suicide theory that had not been adequately addressed by the initial investigation. Most significantly, the physical requirements for Calvi to have hanged himself from the scaffolding would have been extremely difficult for an overweight 62-year-old man to accomplish, particularly while carrying several kilograms of bricks in his pockets. The family's campaign for a new investigation was supported by forensic experts who identified additional problems with the suicide theory. Dr. Keith Simpson, one of Britain's leading forensic pathologists, noted that Calvi's hands and shoes showed no traces of rust or paint from the scaffolding, suggesting that he had not climbed on the metal structure himself. More significantly, the positioning of Calvi's body was inconsistent with what would be expected from a suicide. The rope was attached to scaffolding that would have required considerable athletic ability to reach, while the banker's physical condition and the weight of the bricks in his pockets would have made such climbing extremely difficult, if not impossible. These concerns prompted a second coroner's inquest in June 1983, which returned an open verdict after hearing testimony from forensic experts who challenged the original suicide ruling. The open verdict indicated that the court could not determine the cause of death with sufficient certainty to rule either suicide or murder definitively. The second inquest's findings opened the door for Calvi's family to pursue life insurance claims that had been denied based on the original suicide ruling. But more importantly, it provided the foundation for continuing investigations that would eventually expose the international conspiracy behind Calvi's murder. The breakthrough in understanding Calvi's death came in the 1990s, when his family hired Kroll Associates, an American investigative firm specializing in complex financial crimes. Kroll's investigators, led by Jeff Katz in London, brought sophisticated forensic techniques and international resources to bear on a case that had been beyond the capabilities of traditional police methods. Kroll's investigation revealed crucial evidence that had been overlooked or ignored by the original police inquiry. Most importantly, they discovered that Calvi had been staying at a flat in Chelsea Cloisters during his final days in London, and that this location had also been used by individuals with connections to organized crime and intelligence services. The investigation also revealed that Sergio Vaccari, a small-time drug dealer who had used the same Chelsea Cloisters flat, had been found dead several months before Calvi's murder, under circumstances that were remarkably similar. Like Calvi, Vaccari's body had been found with bricks stuffed in his clothing, suggesting that the same individuals might have been responsible for both deaths. More significantly, Vaccari had been found in possession of documents related to propaganda due when his body was discovered, establishing a clear connection between P2 and the methods used in both murders. This evidence suggested that Calvi's death was part of a broader pattern of violence used by the secret lodge to eliminate individuals who threatened its security. Kroll's investigators also uncovered evidence of extensive surveillance that had been conducted against Calvi during his final weeks in London. Phone records and witness statements revealed that his movements had been closely monitored by individuals with sophisticated intelligence capabilities, suggesting that professional assassins had been tracking him for some time before his murder. Perhaps most importantly, Kroll's investigation identified several individuals who had been present in London during Calvi's final week and who had connections to the criminal organizations that wanted him dead. These individuals included Flavio Carboni, the Sardinian businessman who had arranged Calvi's trip to London, Ernesto Diotallevi, a member of Rome's criminal underworld with ties to both P2 and international drug trafficking, and Francesco Di Carlo, a Sicilian mafioso who was living in London at the time of Calvi's death. The evidence assembled by Kroll Associates convinced British authorities to reopen the case as a murder investigation in September 2003. The new inquiry, led by the City of London Police, used modern forensic techniques to re-examine physical evidence from the crime scene, while pursuing international cooperation to investigate the conspiracy behind Calvi's death. The reopened investigation quickly identified 5 individuals who were believed to have been involved in planning or executing Calvi's murder. In addition to Carboni, Diottelevi and Diarcalo, investigators focused on Giuseppe Calò, the Sicilian Mafia leader who had lost millions of dollars through Banco Ambrosiano's collapse, and Manuela Kleinzig, an Austrian woman who had been Di Carlo's girlfriend and who allegedly participated in the conspiracy. Italian prosecutors issued arrest warrants for all 5 suspects in 2005, leading to a trial that began in Rome in October of that year. The prosecution's case argued that the defendants had conspired to murder Calvi in order to prevent him from revealing details of money laundering operations that had involved the Sicilian Mafia, Propaganda Due, and the Vatican Bank. According to the prosecution's theory, the decision to kill Calvi had been made collectively by representatives of the various criminal organizations that had used his services for money laundering. The murder had been carried out by professional assassins using methods designed to send a warning to other potential informants about the consequences of betraying criminal secrets. The prosecution argued that Calvi had been lured to Blackfriars Bridge under the pretense of meeting potential investors, where he was strangled by his assassins before his body was staged to appear like a suicide. The bricks in his pockets were intended to weight down his body and prevent it from being discovered quickly, while the location was chosen to send a symbolic message to other P2 members. But despite years of investigation and extensive circumstantial evidence, the prosecution was unable to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. The defendants' lawyers successfully argued that the evidence was insufficient to establish their client's guilt, while highlighting the lack of direct witnesses or physical evidence linking the accused to the murder scene. In June 2007, all 5 defendants were acquitted due to what the court described as insufficient evidence to support the murder charges. The acquittals were a devastating blow to investigators who had spent over 2 decades trying to solve one of the most complex criminal conspiracies in modern history. The failure to convict anyone for Calvi's murder reflected both the sophistication of the criminal organizations involved and the inherent difficulties in investigating international conspiracies that crossed multiple jurisdictions. The defendants had carefully avoided leaving direct evidence of their involvement while maintaining plausible alibis that made it difficult to place them at the scene of the crime. More fundamentally, the acquittals demonstrated the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies attempting to prosecute criminal organizations that possess extensive resources and sophisticated security capabilities. The same factors that had made Calvi's money laundering operations successful, compartmentalization, international scope, and corrupt official protection, also made it extremely difficult to gather evidence that would satisfy the high standards required for criminal convictions. Although no one was ever convicted for Roberto Calvi's murder, the investigations that followed his death succeeded in exposing much of the international criminal conspiracy he had served. The details revealed during these inquiries provided law enforcement agencies with unprecedented insight into how organized crime, corrupt financial institutions, and secret societies had collaborated to create one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations in history. The murder of Roberto Calvi sent shockwaves throughout the international financial system that would reshape banking regulation, Vatican operations, and law enforcement approaches to organized crime for decades to come. While his killers succeeded in silencing him permanently, they could not prevent the eventual exposure of the criminal empire he had helped create, or the lasting consequences that would flow from its collapse. The most immediate impact of Calvi's death was the complete destruction of Banco Ambrosiano and the exposure of the Vatican's deep involvement in international money laundering operations. When investigators finally gained access to the bank's complete financial records, they discovered the scope of illegal activities that had been conducted under the cover of legitimate banking services. The Vatican's position became increasingly untenable as evidence mounted of church officials' knowledge and participation in Banco Ambrosiano's criminal activities. Internal Vatican documents revealed that Archbishop Paul Marcinkus had been fully aware that they were facilitating illegal financial transactions while earning millions of dollars in fees for their services. Faced with potential criminal prosecution and massive civil liability, the Vatican initially attempted to deny legal responsibility for Banco Ambrosiano's collapse. Church lawyers argued that the letters of comfort signed by Marcinkus were meaningless documents that created no binding obligations for the Vatican Bank, But this position became impossible to maintain, as evidence mounted of the Vatican's active participation in the bank's operations. Internal church correspondence showed that Vatican officials had not only known about illegal transactions, but had actively participated in designing schemes to circumvent banking regulations and move money without government detection. Ultimately, the Vatican agreed to pay $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors in what it characterized as a recognition of moral involvement rather than legal liability. This settlement, announced in 1984, allowed the Church to avoid criminal prosecution while providing partial compensation to victims of the banking scandal. But the financial cost was only part of the damage suffered by the Vatican. The scandal severely undermined the Church's moral authority and raised serious questions about its commitment to ethical principles in financial matters. The revelation that church money had been used to support right-wing death squads in Latin America was particularly damaging to the Vatican's international reputation. Archbishop Marcinkus, who had once been considered a potential candidate for cardinal, found his career effectively ended by the scandal. He remained within Vatican City for several years to avoid potential arrest by Italian authorities, before eventually retiring to Arizona, where he maintained his silence about Vatican financial operations until his death in 2006. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal also triggered sweeping changes in Italian banking regulation, designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. The Bank of Italy implemented new requirements for monitoring international transactions and reporting suspicious activities, while strengthening oversight of offshore banking operations. More significantly, the scandal contributed to broader reforms in European banking regulation that enhanced cooperation between national authorities and established new standards for combating money laundering. The techniques pioneered by Calvi for moving money through offshore jurisdictions prompted regulatory responses that made similar operations much more difficult to conduct. For the Sicilian Mafia, Calvi's death marked the end of an era when organized crime could rely on sophisticated banking services to launder the proceeds of drug trafficking. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano's network forced Cosa Nostra to develop new methods for moving money, while increased law enforcement attention made it much more dangerous to operate large-scale financial conspiracies. Giuseppe Callo, the mafia leader who had been most closely associated with Calvi's operations, was eventually arrested and convicted on numerous charges, including his role in planning the banker's murder. Although he was acquitted of the murder charges due to insufficient evidence, he received life sentences for other crimes, including drug trafficking and terrorist activities. The exposure of propaganda dues activities led to the disbanding of the Secret Lodge and criminal prosecutions of many of its members. Licio Gelli, the lodge's Grand Master, was convicted of multiple crimes including fraud and conspiracy, though he managed to avoid the most serious charges related to terrorist activities and political subversion. More broadly, the P2 scandal prompted significant reforms in Italian political institutions designed to prevent similar infiltration by secret organizations. New laws prohibited government officials from membership in secret societies, while enhanced oversight mechanisms were established to monitor potential conflicts of interest. The international implications of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal extended far beyond Italy's borders. American authorities used information from the investigation to pursue cases against organized crime figures who had used Calvi's network for money laundering, leading to numerous convictions and the disruption of several major criminal enterprises. The scandal also prompted changes in American banking regulation and intelligence activities. The revelation that CIA money had flowed through Banco Ambrosiano's network to support Contra rebels in Nicaragua contributed to congressional investigations that resulted in new oversight mechanisms for covert operations. For the families of Banco Ambrosiano's victims, the consequences of Calvi's criminal empire extended far beyond financial losses. Hundreds of ordinary depositors lost their life savings when the bank collapsed, while several individuals who had threatened to expose the bank's illegal activities were murdered or died under suspicious circumstances. The family of Giorgio Ambrosoli, the court-appointed liquidator who was murdered for investigating Michele Sindona's banks, spent decades seeking justice for his killing. Similar efforts were undertaken by the families of other victims, including journalists and magistrates who had been targeted for their investigations into organized crime activities. The Calvi family's own quest for justice became a decades-long campaign that ultimately succeeded in overturning the original suicide verdict and establishing that Roberto Calvi had been murdered. Although no one was ever convicted for his killing, the family's efforts helped expose the international conspiracy that had led to his death. Carlo Calvi, Roberto's son, dedicated much of his life to investigating his father's murder and the criminal activities that had led to it. His research, conducted from his home in Montreal, assembled one of the most comprehensive archives of information about international organized crime activities during the 1970s and 1980s. The broader legacy of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal includes significant advances in international cooperation against organized crime and money laundering. The techniques developed for investigating Calvi's network became models for pursuing other complex financial crimes, while the legal precedents established during related prosecutions strengthened law enforcement capabilities. Modern anti-money laundering regulations trace their origins partly to lessons learned from the Banco Ambrosiano collapse. The requirements for banks to know their customers, monitor suspicious transactions, and report potential criminal activities all reflect regulatory responses to the techniques that Calvi had pioneered for moving dirty money. The scandal also contributed to increased transparency in Vatican financial operations. Under pressure from the international community, the Church gradually implemented reforms designed to align Vatican banking practices with international standards and prevent future involvement in illegal activities. These reforms included new oversight mechanisms for Vatican Bank operations, enhanced due diligence procedures for large transactions, and greater cooperation with international authorities investigating potential financial crimes. While the Vatican maintained its commitment to banking secrecy for legitimate religious activities, it acknowledged the need for greater accountability in its financial operations. The cultural impact of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal extended into popular literature, film, and journalism that explored the intersection of organized crime, political corruption, and religious institutions. The story of God's banker became a symbol of how legitimate institutions could be corrupted when their leaders prioritized profit over principles. Perhaps most importantly, the scandal demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies could eventually be exposed through persistent investigation and international cooperation. While Calvi's murderers succeeded in silencing him, they could not prevent the eventual revelation of the criminal empire he had helped create, or the accountability that followed its exposure. The death of Roberto Calvi marked the end of an era when organized crime could operate with relative impunity in the international financial system. The regulatory changes, law enforcement capabilities, and public awareness that resulted from investigating his murder created a much more hostile environment for similar criminal enterprises, though the ongoing evolution of both criminal techniques and legitimate financial services ensures that the struggle against money laundering continues today. When Roberto Calvi's body was cut down from Blackfriars Bridge on June 18, 1982, it marked the end of one of the most extraordinary criminal careers in modern history. The mild-mannered Italian banker, who had spent 35 years building a reputation as a pillar of Milan's Catholic business community, had actually been operating the most sophisticated money laundering empire ever created, moving billions of dollars for everyone from Sicilian drug lords to Vatican cardinals to CIA operatives. The scale of Calvi's operations defied comprehension even by the standards of international organized crime. Through his network of offshore banks and shell companies, he had facilitated transactions worth tens of billions of dollars, while serving clients whose activities ranged from legitimate business to terrorism. Money had flowed through his system to finance everything from mafia heroin trafficking to Vatican anti-communist operations to CIA covert activities in Central America. Yet for all his sophistication and connections, Calvi ultimately fell victim to the same forces that destroy most criminal enterprises: greed, betrayal, and the inevitable conflicts that arise when different criminal organizations compete for the same resources. His mistake was believing that his knowledge and usefulness would protect him from partners who had built their power on violence and intimidation. The investigation that followed Calvi's death revealed the true scope of corruption that had infected some of the world's most respected institutions. The Vatican Bank, which claimed to serve God's work on earth, had become a front for money laundering operations that supported drug trafficking and political assassination. Banco Ambrosiano, founded to serve Catholic families, had been transformed into a clearinghouse for criminal money from around the world. Most shocking of all was the revelation that propaganda due had created a shadow state within Italy's democratic institutions, placing its members in positions where they could manipulate investigations, influence court decisions, and coordinate terrorist attacks designed to destabilize the country's legitimate government. The lodge's membership list read like a directory of Italian power, including politicians, judges, generals, intelligence officials, and business leaders who had sworn secret oaths to undermine the democracy they publicly claimed to serve. The human cost of these conspiracies extended far beyond the criminals who participated in them. Hundreds of ordinary bank depositors lost their life savings when Banco Ambrosiano collapsed. Dozens of journalists, magistrates, and investigators who tried to expose the truth were murdered or intimidated into silence. Entire communities in Latin America suffered under right-wing death squads that were financed through Calvi's network with money that originated in Vatican accounts. Perhaps most tragic of all were the victims who died simply because they knew too much about activities they had never chosen to participate in. Giorgio Ambrosoli, the court-appointed liquidator who was murdered for investigating Michel Sindona's banks, was killed because he had discovered evidence of financial crimes that threatened powerful criminals. Graziella Corrichere, Calvi's longtime secretary who committed suicide as Banco Ambrosiano, died because she could no longer live with the knowledge of her employer's betrayal of everyone who had trusted him. The failure to convict anyone for Calvi's murder reflects both the sophistication of modern organized crime and the inherent limitations of legal systems designed for a simpler world. The same globalization that had made Calvi's money laundering possible also made it extremely difficult for law enforcement agencies to gather evidence that could survive the scrutiny of criminal courts operating under different legal systems. But the broader investigation of Calvi's empire achieved something more important than individual prosecutions. It exposed the mechanisms through which organized crime infiltrates legitimate institutions and demonstrated that even the most powerful criminal conspiracies can eventually be held accountable for their actions. The regulatory changes, international cooperation agreements, and enforcement capabilities that resulted from these investigations have made it much more difficult for similar operations to function today. The Vatican's payment of $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors, while officially characterized as a gesture of moral responsibility rather than legal liability, represented a tacit acknowledgement that the Church had participated in illegal activities that harmed innocent people. More significantly, it prompted internal reforms that have gradually aligned Vatican financial operations with international standards for preventing money laundering. The collapse of propaganda due and the subsequent prosecution of its members marked the end of the most ambitious attempt to subvert democratic institutions through secret infiltration in modern European history. While individual P2 members escaped serious punishment, the exposure of the lodge's activities made it impossible for similar organizations to operate with the same impunity. For the Sicilian Mafia, Calvi's death marked the beginning of a new era of law enforcement pressure that would eventually destroy much of the organization's traditional power. The techniques developed for investigating Banco Ambrosiano's operations provided authorities with new capabilities for pursuing organized crime activities, leading to numerous convictions and the disruption of several major criminal enterprises. The international implications of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal continue to resonate today in ongoing efforts to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. The offshore financial techniques that Calvi pioneered have been adapted by modern criminals, but they now operate under much greater scrutiny from authorities who understand how these systems can be abused. Modern banking regulations requiring institutions to know their customers, monitor suspicious transactions, and report potential criminal activities all trace their origins to lessons learned from Calvi's operations. While determined criminals continue to find new ways to launder money, they must now contend with legal frameworks specifically designed to detect and prevent the kinds of activities that Calvi conducted with relative ease. The story of Roberto Calvi serves as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of money on institutions that claim to serve higher purposes. The Vatican's pursuit of financial gain led it to compromise its moral authority and violate the very principles it claimed to uphold. Banco Ambrosiano's transformation from a Catholic family bank into a criminal enterprise demonstrates how quickly legitimate institutions can be perverted when their leaders prioritize profit over principle. Perhaps most importantly, Calvi's story reveals how individual ambition and institutional corruption can combine to create criminal enterprises that threaten the foundations of democratic society. The conspiracy he served aimed at nothing less than the overthrow of Italy's constitutional government and its replacement with an authoritarian regime controlled by secret organizations accountable to no one. The ultimate failure of this conspiracy demonstrates that truth has a way of emerging even when powerful forces conspire to suppress it. While Calvi's murderers succeeded in silencing him, they could not prevent investigators from eventually exposing much of what he knew about their criminal activities. The persistence of his family, the dedication of journalists and investigators, and the gradual accumulation of evidence eventually revealed the true scope of the international conspiracy that had cost him his life. Roberto Calvi died as he had lived, caught between competing criminal organizations whose interests he could no longer serve. His death sent a message that resonated throughout the international criminal underworld about the fate awaiting those who threatened their former partners. But it also marked the beginning of investigations that would ultimately expose the criminal empire he had helped create and ensure that its most dangerous elements could never again operate with the same impunity. The banker, who called himself a servant of God, had actually served much darker masters, and his death revealed the true cost of placing personal ambition above moral principle in a world where the most powerful criminals will kill to protect their secrets.